Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. So my name is Zinat Ladak. I am a CSPC Program Committee member and volunteer. We would like to acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Centre Conference is taking place on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. So today we are kicking off on this very snowy day, so thank you for coming. We're about to participate in an interactive panel titled, How Do We Make Open Access Sustainable for Scientific Publishing? And this panel is organized by the Canadian Science Publishing. I just want to mention that there is Wi-Fi for the conference today. You can find it titled Weston Conference, and then the password is CSPC 2022 in capital letters. There's also the conference app if you have not downloaded it. The app is called Event Mobi, and then you find the CSPC app by typing in CSPC 2022 again in capital letters. So this app is necessary if you want to participate in any polls of any panels throughout the conference, and it also shows you the agenda and any speakers, and you can connect with speakers as well on the app. If you have any questions about the app, you can find me after the session. Don't forget to tweet about CSPC at Science Policy and use the hashtag CSPC 2022 throughout the conference. And also don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for this panel, which is also on the app. Your feedback is important to us to improve our conference for next year as well. And now I will give it over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Zinat, and thank you everyone for joining us today, especially braving the weather to get here so early this morning. As Zinat mentioned, my name is Michael Donaldson, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Canadian Science Publishing. We're a not-for-profit publisher based here in Ottawa. Today is kind of a fitting time to have a discussion on open access, and in fact, this year, 2022, actually marks the 20th anniversary of the Budapest Open Access Initiative. That was one of the first major reports that came out that really defined the term open access and really made it a common phrase. And in fact, the definition that was proposed at the Budapest Open Access Initiative report is still one that's used widely today. And I'd just like to quote that. By open access to this literature, we mean its free availability on the public internet, permitting any users to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, or link to the full text of these articles, crawl them for indexing, pass them as data to software, or use them for any other lawful purpose without financial, legal, or technical barriers other than those inseparable from gaining access to the internet itself. And then a second part of that definition is the only constraint on reproduction and distribution and the only role for copyright in this domain should be to give authors control over the integrity of their work and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. So that definition, although it's maybe a little bit verbose than we typically use for open access, it's still one that we so commonly use today, especially including the mention of copyright and author rights as well. Now, in the past 20 years, open access has certainly grown. We now have a number of other terms for sort of variations on open access, including green open access, and that's where papers are made freely accessible as the author-accepted version of the manuscript, typically via an open access repository. There's also gold open access, where papers are immediately and freely accessible on the publisher's website as a version of record via a fee paid on behalf of the author, and they are typically published with a CC BY copyright license. There's also diamond and platinum open access as well. A diamond or platinum model typically receives financial support from one or more institutions or organizations and thus does not have an article processing charge on the author's behalf. And this is the path that's being pursued by Coalition Publica, which is a Canadian organization that enables a platform for journals to be published for social sciences and humanities research. So over the past 20 years, much has changed in the open access front. We've certainly seen quite a bit of growth. There have been new open access journals launched. There's been more and more open access content published. And we're seeing a great transition where traditionally subscription-based access to content is now shifting more towards open access. And in fact, over the past couple of years, we've actually seen now that there's more open access content being published globally than there is subscription-based content, which is amazing to see. And certainly in the past 3 years with COVID-19, the value of open access publishing and that rapid dissemination of trusted peer-reviewed research without any barriers has really been demonstrated. Currently, there's a number of international drivers and policies that are really shaping open access at a global scale. There's Plan S, which is in Europe, but also includes the FRQ in Canada. There's the UKRI, there's the recent US OSTP memo. There's also Horizon Europe with Canadian involvement as well. And also within Canada, we have our Canadian Open Science Roadmap as well, which is shaping our policies on open access and open data as well. So within Canada, we're a research powerhouse, and open access is certainly key to Canadian research. And today, I hope that we can really dive into the themes around equity of open access, sustainability of open access, and really try to get a sense of how we can move Canada forward on the global stage when it comes to open access. I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple polling questions. So if you do happen to have the app and you're interested in answering the questions, the first one is just to get a sense of who is in the room. We have a very great diverse audience here at CSPC, so we're keen to know who we have in the room. So if you're able to answer that question, that would be great. There's also a second question as well that talks about why you feel open access is important. And if you'd like to answer that question now, you're welcome to as well. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to our panelists now with a first question for Sapna, which would be, why is open access important to you? And it might be an opportunity for each panelist to introduce themselves and talk about specifically what their stakeholder group is interested in when it comes to open access. I'll just mention quickly that we're very fortunate today because we have a very diverse stakeholder panelist group. We have a funder, a researcher, a library representative, and also a publisher representative as well. So we'll hear some really great diverse voices today. So Sapna, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, good morning. It's very nice to be here. I'm Sapna Mahajan. I'm the Director of Genomics and Society at Genome Canada. And like the title says, a lot of the focus of my work is trying to bridge the gap between genomics and society. And Genome Canada, we've been around for about 20 years, and I can see we actually have regional centers, and I have Genome Quebec I can see here, and Genome Alberta. And so for about more than 20 years, we've been funding research and innovation in genomics and really trying to address complex challenges for today and tomorrow. So to that point, we're trying to be impact driven. And as a research funder, we're trying not to just fund a bunch of research and say, okay, well, hope things go well with that, and actually try to help with the pathway to impact. And that's not just knowledge mobilization and translation, but it's this open access piece. And if we are publicly funded, I strongly believe that the public needs to benefit from our investments. And those investments have to have the largest value. We can't just fund a bunch of research, let it sit on a shelf, or just tell researchers, you figure it out and hope it gets, commercialized and adopted. So when we talk about open access, open science, genomics is a data science. So open data, open science, it's a huge piece to our work. And I would say we have a long way to go on the genomic side to really be as open and equitable as we'd like to be. So this very much interests me. And so I'll leave it there just as a funder.
Good morning. It's great to see everyone in person. My name is Stephanie Haustein. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Ottawa, and I also co-direct the Scholarly Communications Lab together with my colleague Juan Pablo Alperin at SFU. And we are a group of researchers that are interested in evaluating and analyzing any aspect of scholarly communication, particularly in the digital age, as well as a focus on open science. So I am a researcher myself that practices or tries my best to practice open science and publish open access, but I also do research about it. So why do I think open access is important? I think we live in such a, we have such a great opportunity with the digital era that theoretically we could be accessing any knowledge that exists in the world. But because of a business model interfering with that, where this kind of access is restricted through paywalls. And I think open access is the way to remove those paywalls and provide equitable and completely free access to the literature. And that goes for any researcher, right? If I want to access the knowledge to read the papers that my colleagues have published, but also for the public. As Sapna just said, it's really important that, particular for publicly funded research, that it's accessible and that we don't let for-profit companies intervene and basically ask us to buy back the content that we provided for free, the quality control that we provide for free through peer review. So all of us academics and researchers at publicly funded institutions, they're already paid to do all of the scholarly communication process. The problem is that now a lot of publishers, particularly the for-profit ones, are making a lot of money just by turning a manuscript into a fancy-looking PDF and adding a paywall to it. So I think it's really important that we remove that remove all the paywalls and provide access for free so that everybody can participate in research, but also have access to the knowledge.
Good morning. My name is Claire Apavu. I am the Executive Director at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. CRKN's mission is to advance interconnected, sustainable access to the world's research and to Canada's documentary heritage content. And our members represent 81 institutions across Canada, including world-class academic libraries and research institutions, 2 national libraries, that's LAC and BANQ, and Canada's largest public library system, Toronto Public Library. As an organization that serves libraries who ultimately serve the research community, we are deeply committed to absolutely advancing the availability of research content to in an open fashion to the community. And I fully agree that publicly funded research should be publicly available. When CRKN merged in 2018 with a sister organization, Canadiana.org, we were able to turn within a year to remove the paywall to access that primary source digital documentary heritage content. And since that time, we have been working to continue to advance that on the humanities and social sciences side through Canadiana. On the our licensing activities that we do on behalf of university libraries across the country ensure that we are providing access to those much beloved Big Five institution publisher content. So Elsevier, Sage, Wiley, Taylor and Francis. We negotiate and provide access to the subscriptions to that content. What we are doing is working on multiple pathways to transition to open access. So with the largest commercial publishers, we are working on, I hate to call them transformative agreements. Let's call them read and publish agreements. How transformative they are remains to be seen, but at the same time, we need to provide at least that important research content that Canadian authors and researchers are publishing in those large journals. We want that content to be publicly available. So we work to leverage the subscription dollars that we are already paying to those large publishers to turn that into funding for Canadian authors to publish at no charge to the author in those journals. It's a long, slow process, and there is definitely not enough money from library dollars only to make that transition. And we know we're working very closely with the Canadian Science Publishing to find a way to bridge that gap. So we've been successful with Sage, for example, to have an agreement where our subscription dollars are transitioned to paying for our Canadian authors to publish in Sage journals. Great. In addition, we work closely with other open access initiatives. We are partners with Erudit for Coalition Publica, and our members provide extensive funding to that initiative to transition journals, Canadian journals, into open access. We also work with other open access initiatives globally. A SCOPE, for example, SCOPE 3, which is the Sponsoring Consortium for Open Access Publishing in Particle Physics. Say that fast 3 times. I'm the chair of the Scope 3 Governing Council, and it's really great to be working internationally and globally with other organizations on that. And yeah, I think just a deep commitment to ensuring not only that sustainable access, but access in a way that is truly accessible to all.
Thanks, Claire. My name's Adrian Stanley. I'm the General Manager of JMR Publications. We're a Toronto-based open access publisher. We actually open access in 1999, before the Budapest Declaration. Why is open access important for us? You know, transparency, building on the science. We were started and founded by a medical doctor, a scientific editor who just believed in the power of the internet. We work in the sort of digital health space that merges disciplines between medical sciences and computer sciences, so bringing sort of interdisciplinary discoverability of work. Open access content, if you read a number of studies, is often cited more, used more, downloaded more, brings greater transparency. So we've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid a long time ago. But we also we're also a sort of disruptor. We like to disrupt the scholarly communications system. So we encourage people to publish research protocols. We have a preprint server for publishing research early. We bring a valuable service of peer reviewing this research and bringing communities together. The journal editors really act as a sort of conduit for both controlling the quality, but working together with researchers to improve the quality. It's also important, I think, to make sure that knowledge is translated. So we do a lot of work in translating from whether it's author videos or infographics that distill that sort of science into usable material. But I'm also here as I'm a past president for the Society of Scholarly Publishing. And one of my charges there, I helped start a task force that brought funders, publishers, stakeholders together to really sort of discuss where there are alliances and similarities and commonalities, things like persistent identifiers all the way through the workflows. So I'm sort of wearing 2 hats today of bringing people together, but also the publisher's hat. So thank you, Michael.
That's great. Excuse me. Thank you so much, everyone. Great introductions and great to hear the different perspectives on open access and why it's important. For our next question, and this ties a little bit in with our introduction, looking outside of Canada and perhaps at other countries that are beginning to shape different open access policies at a global scale. As I mentioned earlier, there's Plan S, there's UKRI, JISC, the OSTP memo in the US. There's certainly a lot to keep an eye on at a global scale, and so much has been changing over the past few years in terms of open access policies and initiatives. So maybe I'll ask that as a question. What can we learn from other countries, other open access policies, and maybe how might those policies fit within a Canadian context? Claire or Adrian, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. I think certainly if you can find some really great examples from around the world. We have a map, so we have a graphic somewhere, Michael, right, of the different sort of progress of open access. Here we go. So I know sort of in Brazil, there's a lot of national infrastructure there. There's a platform called CLO that really develops the sort of local publishing of open access content through policy, through connected policies. There's a lot of other areas that are really focusing in the UK. The organizations like JISC work across to really develop OA agreements and make content more open access. So I think all around the world, as you've seen, the OSTP memo in the US is really driving policy that is really listened to. If you're sort of listening on some of the listservs of publishers, you'll hear that certainly when Coalition S came out and Plan S, it really made people stop and think that the subscription model is going to be harder to maintain, and open access is coming along at some point. There are different flavors of open access, but I think we really need to, Canada, it's really important Canada sets its own sort of stage, but is involved in those global discussions as well. And I'm sure, Claire, you're part of those discussions, right?
Yeah, whoa, the sound just came on. Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly from a library consortia point of view, we look to many of our colleagues around the world. I think of folks like BibSam in Sweden, who they really have done a great job of harnessing from all the way through the same path and agenda between government and the academic community and government libraries as well. So it's kind of a consistent message across the board, and then they work together to harness the funds that are going not only to the largest journal commercial publishers, but also, to smaller, more innovative publishers. And that is combined together with funds that are being used to pay separately for APCs in the wild, like trying to bring that money together so that we can leverage that more effectively to build the kind of publishing environment, or beyond publishing, whatever that might look like in the future, in really interesting ways. So we definitely look to some of our colleagues. I think we're very fortunate in Canada. I mean, we work with colleagues in the south of us here in the United States, and we're great at being able to work collaboratively in Canada across the country. And although we are a large geographic nation, small in some ways, and so we're able to do some things collaboratively that others to the south of us wish they could at times. And we also look at folks like the California Digital Library, who've been very effective at being able to make some transition together with the research community. So I think there are things to be learned. I think when I look at Europe and the adoption of PIDs, you mentioned that, Adrian, and CRKN is the administrative lead organization for both ORCID Canada and DataCite Canada, working together with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and the Alliance. We are very much see that as being part of the solution in terms of being able to advance what we're doing in an open fashion, and being able to track even and understand how is our money being spent.
Yeah, if I may add to that from a researcher, but also a researcher on the topic's perspective, a lot has happened internationally in the last months and the last years. It's really hard to keep track of all the changes that are made policy-wise, which I think it's great that finally the public and governments and government funders are realizing that things need to change, because 20 years down the road, we're not there yet. And we've also observed that the initial ideas of what open access should be in terms of removing barriers and being equitable are not achieved, because we have things like APCs where now the barrier is removed from the reader if the publication is open access, but now the author has to pay often $3,000 or more. In biomed, it's really common to pay $5,000. You've probably heard that Nature is now charging more than $10,000 for the so-called hybrid publications. And that is a big problem. And now we have barriers not on the reader's end, but on the author's end, and that people can't afford. Even people with funding, or at institutions that are generally well funded, if for me the difference is between hiring a research assistant for a semester or publishing one paper, that's a big problem. So, but what I think, looking at the bigger picture of changing policy and internationally, I think what we can learn from this, that it really needs the top-down policy changes for things to happen. So individual researchers, even the ones that have understood that open access is better and open science is science done right, they're struggling to change and to publish in the right journals. Ideally diamond open access, where neither the author nor the reader has to pay. because the academic reward system is still so traditional that in order to get a tenure track position, to get tenure, you have to publish in the right journals, in the high impact journals. And unfortunately, those high impact journals are controlled by the big oligopoly, by the for-profit companies, and they, just because they can, charge $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per article, while we have actually a number of studies that show that it can be sustainable to run an academic journal with maybe an APC of the Fair Open Access Alliance said up to $1,000, but often for a few $100s. Because you have to remember that all the content is provided for free. All the quality control is provided for free. Yes, maybe the editor-in-chief does receive a little bit of money to run things, but we also have the entire infrastructure for free. We have tools like OJS, where you can run an entire journal for free on open software. So the entire system needs to change, but I think because researchers are so stuck in that traditional reward system, and they've been trying to change, but it's really hard. And I can tell you from a personal perspective that I don't publish in hybrid anymore, but when I was a doctoral student, that's what I did, because, you know, it said, oh, open access, shiny new thing, let's do that. And it's really hard to change if you're just an individual. So I think the change has to come from the top down, and it has to be drastic. And it has to also take into account that I feel kind of it's an arms race. So Plan S has really great aspects in the sense of that they're saying no more funding for hybrid. But then there was a little loophole to say, well, there's funding for hybrid still if there's a transformative agreement in place. And for me, transformative agreements on the journal's end are just another perversion of open access, because now publishers are just using those to get even more money out. Some people might think it's a good way because we're spending money that we're already spending on subscription for that, but it's just another way of the publishers locking us in. And I think we also need to remember that the for-profit publishers, especially the big five, have profit margins of 30% or higher. So that means every taxpayer dollar that we're using to pay either subscription, which is still the majority of the amounts that we put in there, but also APCs, 30 cents of that dollar are leaving the academic community and they're going into shareholders' pockets. Those are for-profit companies. They don't really care about the publication itself. Their main focus is on making profits. And I think that's actually a scandal that we're allowing mostly taxpayer dollars to go into for-profit businesses. And that's why I think it needs a drastic change. And it needs to be the entire community. And I think that's why we need to work together with libraries, with funders, with researchers, with the community to change the system and go for diamond open access journals, support the open infrastructure. You mentioned PIDs, and all of the infrastructure to make publishing happen are really important. So I would say it's really important to learn from that and fund the publishing and not the companies.
Do you mind if I just add a little bit to that? There's a really interesting example. I was part of a delegation with I used to live in China with Chinese sort of policy funders and Brazilian. And they came together, and I was lucky to be sort of a fly on the wall. And they were talking about their open access policies. And what was really interesting was Brazil had sort of policies, but they also helped develop a system to implement the infrastructure where sort of China set the policy and then they let their publishers and people follow it. So I think it's interesting, sort of a question of where Canada is. Do you set policies and then let people kind of adapt them, or is there more of a systematic approach to an infrastructure? There's some really interesting technologies coming out, like the OA switchboard that does connect metadata from funders, from researchers, from publishers, that while still early, I think has a lot of potential to share data and make data available to everybody. So.
Just a small piece when we're talking internationally, and I was talking internally about this and trying to get a better grasp of the international landscape. And what came up was, the UK often people talk about, but there was 47 million pounds put to implementation, and they still are shifting. And so I think one big piece is, as this is happening, there's different models all around the world. We need to really look at those pieces. And I think from a funder's perspective, and obviously policy, and I agree, it needs to start all the different stakeholders. It's a paradigm shift. It's a significant shift. But if you just make a shift here, you're not going to see a result. But I think you have to think about the picture, the implementation, and we need to evaluate how the models are working in different countries, all the different aspects, and the money that's flowing to it that sometimes is not talked about. So,
Sorry, I just want to add a small comment that in Canada, we have an open access policy. The Tri-Agency has one, right? But when we analyze publications, and actually my student Leanne Butler is here, and she did her master thesis on looking at how did publications in the Web of Science, which isn't all, but significant amount that acknowledge Tri-Agency funding, are they actually open access? And if so, how much was paid for that? And we actually find that it's just over 50%. So that means that 50% of authors that receive funding from the Tri-Agency are actually not following the policy. And I think that's a big issue in Canada. There's a lot of research that actually shows in order for people to follow a policy, you also need to monitor and enforce it. And that's a lack we have in Canada. Like, the Tri-Agencies do not monitor and do not track how much their authors are actually following the policy. So I think that's a big piece in order to ensure compliance, and PlanAS does that, right? So it's a piece of PlanAS to monitor if funded researchers are actually publishing open access.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's a very great set of answers to that question, and I really appreciate the diverse perspectives. I just wonder if it's possible to show our poll results. I don't know if that's something for questions 1 and 2. I don't know if we're able to or not. If not, no problem. But looks like we knew. Excuse me. We knew that it might be a challenge. I think we're the first session of the day, so we may not have the results. But anyway, the other aspect too that I'd just like to mention is, if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question during the discussion, you're more than welcome to. There's a microphone in the middle of the room. You can also ask a question through the app as well, and we welcome any discussion during the course of the panel discussion. So our next question, which actually does sort of pick up, I think, where we left off, and in fact, I think we've already sort of started to go down this road a little bit, is a question around equity of open access. And Stephanie touched on it in particular, this idea that in some cases, we have an issue of access to open access, in the sense that, it can be hard to find the ability to publish open. And as we get more and more content moving to open, it does mean that in some cases, there may be some researchers that aren't able to publish in the journals that they would normally choose to do. So there's inequities within the Global South, perhaps with smaller research institutions as well, or other independent researchers that can't pay. There's a number of folks that may be finding that it becomes more and more challenging. So the question, I guess, to the audience, or to the audience, the question to the panel is, how can we build equity into an open access future? And I don't know if Sapna, if you wanted to start, or perhaps Stephanie.
Okay. Well, as sort of publisher in that side, and working also, there's a group called the OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. We're doing work to look at more consistent APC waivers, the article processing fees that authors pay. Many publishers have policies where, for example, lower middle income countries can apply for waivers if researchers don't have funds. But there's no real consistency across publishers. How these are applied, often it can come down to a decision with the editor, where is the science good, and what's the research, do we want to publish this? But having more robust policies, we do actually spend a lot of money on or create a lot of APC waivers. And it's even one point of defining those. Even, you may have an editor that commissions and asks someone to write an article versus a scholar that's doesn't have the funds to pay. So I think this is a growing, emerging topic where there will be more consistency. Decisions made now, I think, are still very manual based on checklists and things, and I think that needs to change. But as a publisher, we do try to support. We publish authors from over 160 different countries, and many of those can't afford the APCs. So it's a balance, and we do put a lot of our sort of profit towards that, or revenue. There's also sort of calls where publishers and stakeholders could create a central fund that authors could come and call a call on this. So sort of more central initiatives that would really help people that don't have the revenue to pay for the APCs.
I think I mentioned this already, but right now we don't have equity. And I think APCs, especially those that are several $1,000s, are just not equitable. And even waivers are problematic because you're making the researcher beg and prove that they don't have the funding. And I think that research should be published based on the scientific findings and not based on economic barriers. So I think APCs is just not the right ways, especially if they're of several $1,000s. And I also want to mention a way forward towards equity and changing the model is that researchers forget that all they have, like the journal is them as a community. They're serving as peer reviewers, they're the authors, they're on editorial boards. And the only thing that publishers, especially the for-profit publishers, own is the brand name, right? But unfortunately, that brand name, the journal title, has so much weight in the academic reward process. But just to give you an example that it does work to take that entire journal, the content, the quality, and just leave the brand name behind. So there have been a few journals, a really nice example in linguistics where they left Springer and just formed their own journal. I'm also on a board of a journal. We used to be an Elsevier journal, so this is in the Journal of Informametrics. It's really specialized bibliometrics, but we weren't happy anymore with Elsevier. We wanted to be open access. We didn't want to do hybrid, and we also had some issues with regards to open citations. So the editor and the entire editorial board decided we're going to step down. And you can do that. So we just left the Journal of Informametrics, and then we founded a new journal. It's now called Quantitative Science Studies. We're with MIT Press. We do have an APC, but the APC is, I think it's $600 US for members, and I want to say $800 for non-members. So there's no more profit involved. We have the same quality, and I would actually say the quality has improved because we now have the liberty. We had a pilot first, but we've now established open peer review as well. We're encouraging data sharing to make everything transparent. So I just wanted to remind that researchers have the power to leave that kind of relationship with for-profit publishers, because the only thing they often own is the brand name, and you don't really need that if as a community decide we're just making something else. That's the same thing, just with a new name. So I think that's a way forward, but I think, again, like researchers, it needs to be the entire community that makes the step, because it's really hard to do for individual people. And I think as a community, we need to start thinking about funding the infrastructure, and that can be journals, but where you remove the paywall from the reader and the author. So Diamond, I think, is the way forward to do it. I do want to say that publishers, for-profit publishers, are really, really good in finding other ways to make money. We see that with the transformative agreements. And we published a recent study where we estimated how much APCs are paid for open access, hybrid, and gold articles, just for the 5 oligopoly publishers: Elsevier, Springer Nature, Sage, Wiley, and Taylor and Francis, and it was over $1 billion just in open access fees over 4 years. I'm sure the study stopped in 2018. I'm sure it's now much higher. And we did find diamond journals that are, especially Elsevier's, doing that. And that is great in the sense of, yes, it's more equitable because it's removing the paywall for researchers, but I am pretty sure that Elsevier, and we don't have that information, but they're still getting paid by someone to run these journals. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, that if we're now all saying diamond, we also have to keep in mind that for-profit companies will find a way to make profit. So we need to protect that kind of system. And I think a way forward would be to say that it shouldn't be a profitable business to publish academic articles.
Those numbers are astounding. Some of them I haven't heard all those. I'm going to come at it a little bit differently. When, open access to me is about equity and equal opportunity to access knowledge, research, information. And as a funder, I think we have a huge role to play because we show what we value, how people are funded. You've raised it earlier. So I think there's a huge role. And I'm thinking beyond just publishing, because again, genomics is a data science. And so it goes to data and other pieces. And so for me, we're a very diverse country. Forget about looking outside of Canada, within Canada. And when we talk about equity, I think about underrepresented communities, First Nation, Inuit, Métis. And it isn't simply about them having, or different groups having access to published research. It's who's actually doing that research, publishing it, and having access to their own data and information. And so I think as a funder, we're trying to think of open access, not just the publishing, but beyond. I think we have to fundamentally change how we're funding research, where we're putting value on research. And we were just meeting with some First Nation and Métis communities, and they said, instead of just looking at how much we've published or giving money to publish, how about it's actually developing tools to go back to the communities and relay that information? Because the people we want to read this isn't actually this. Or we're just putting equal value. I'm not saying one is more of the other, but I think we have to look at it much broader. And from a genomic science piece, it doesn't matter if we even did open access publishing if the data on that equity piece isn't there. So I think it's all interrelated, but when I think about equity, I think about the bigger pieces, and I also think about sometimes when we're putting OA policies in place, it may actually conflict with some of the First Nation Inuit Métis. I think of OCAP principles and other pieces. So we need to be really cautious about that when we think about equity.
So apologies in advance. I came in a little bit late. Thank you, Snow. So I may have missed it. So apologies. But I was hoping to get your guys' thoughts on publication repositories. So I don't know if was this covered already or no. Okay. So publication. So I've done a bit of work on the kind of the unknown cost of publishing. So we're talking about formatting. We're talking about peer review, open access. And in my experience, at least, a lot of this information is near impossible to find. It's based on a gazillion assumptions that end up being around the billions for a variety of things. One thing that is emerging, so I'm with the Government of Canada in the Office of the Chief Data Officer, and one of our big things right now is around publication repositories. So how can we kind of not go around the open access, but how can we at least put everything in a place that's accessible to Canadians? Because as you've mentioned many times, the money to fund the research is Canadians' dollars. So they should have your mom, your neighbor, whether we can do a better job at doing the knowledge translation is another thing, but they should at least be able to access the information. So along the line of preprints and publication repositories, because there's still costs to that. There's still someone who's running it. There's still just the money for the actual architecture to house the journals, all that kind of stuff. So thanks.
Question, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of money being invested in institutional repositories by universities and, of course, by the government and federal publication repositories. So one of the challenges that we see in my colleagues from CARL, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, are really looking at how can we make those repositories more accessible for researchers to access across all of that content. And then for us at CRKN, because we have a repository of digital heritage and cultural content, primary source content, how does that content then intermingle with the other repository content? How can researchers work across those different repositories of information? So I think there's a huge role to be played there. I do think we need to, the technology continues to change, so there does need to be ongoing investment in that in order to be able to make that not only accessible and across different content types, but also research evolving to meet new research types. And when we think about data, to your point, like crossing, then we add that data component into in the data repositories, and there it's not it is a complex need because and we have to manage. To your point, Sapna, we have to be able to manage rights and be able to understand respectfully where certain types of content should be preserved potentially, but not accessed. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do, and I think there's a lot of great minds in our country that are working on it. And the more that we can do that collaboratively between communities, between the academic community, the government community, and public, I think we will be much more effective.
Add to that very quickly that this is a really great point, and I think the infrastructure already exists. So especially at the Government of Canada, please don't build a new repository. Use the existing ones, and researchers tend to use the repository that works for their community and their field, and there are no borders because we collaborate with other people, and you don't want to keep depositing the same thing in different repositories, then you're not going to have the use. The same, I actually have to say, at U Ottawa, I'm supposed to deposit in the institutional repository, but I don't do that. I use the Nodo because that's where my community is, and you get the visibility. And I think the answer there is also open metadata, PIDs, that actually things are findable. So rather support making the metadata quality in those repositories better, that you find the link to the preprint or the accepted version easier. There are also great tools like Unpaywall, which actually helps you track things down via the DOI if you're hitting a paywall, that you can see if there is somewhere in a repository an open version of this. So please improve and use existing infrastructure. Don't build another silo.
And just to add, actually, I mean, as a publisher, part of our role, we create XML machine-readable tagging formats. We do actually disseminate to PubMed Central, to European PubMed Central, to the Chinese OA Index, CABI Global Ag, database. So, as a publisher, this is one of the roles where you are disseminating and distributing content. But I do agree, like there are a lot of repositories out there. I think one area where it may be interesting to look is there's now newer technologies coming that can check compliances, check if data's been made available, check if publications are open, and I think the compliance sort of is an area to certainly look into. Yeah.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for great panel and great points. I want to seize on a couple of things. Claire said earlier we have a lot of work to do, and with this dossier, it continues to amaze me that the pile seems to get higher and higher in terms of how much work we have to do. But Stephanie said something I think was really quickly important. She mentioned about Elsevier and Diamond and so on. And this, I think, is kind of brought to my attention a whole other issue of this. And it reminds me a little bit about when we started searching for free before we realized that what was happening is that we were making ourselves the commodity. And what I learned recently was, for example, with the Times Higher Education University rankings, is that 38% of the data is based on Elsevier data. And what I'm sensing is that those companies are now starting to evolve themselves into what they call the business intelligence side of things. And I think this really is something, we view publishing, we're pushing out, get our work out there and so on. A little ways we did with Google, searching's free, isn't this wonderful? but we're becoming part of a new kind of economy, a new kind of business model. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, frankly, even somebody like me, this caught me a little unawares, the extent to which this is real traction. And I think is something that we got to pay attention to. So I just wanted to ask your comments on this. Thank you.
Excellent question. You've probably heard of or already read, but there's a new book out by Sarah Lambden called Data Cartels. And she exactly examines this, looking at Thomson Reuters and Elsevier and saying Elsevier is no longer a publisher. It's a data broker. And it's so far that they have actually used like data from LexisNexis and sold that to ISIS. So like, this is like, that's, really problematic that we're supporting these companies. And yes, we have to be aware of that they're no longer just publishers. Elsevier, but also others have basically bought up small startups that now cover the entire research lifecycle, from preprints to peer review, to the publishing process, but especially also what you mentioned with the evaluation system and the reward system. And it's really, really problematic, which again, I think we need to cut loose from these companies and support the open infrastructure, and not allow these things to happen. I mean, there's surveillance of like who has, done what with a certain PDF that they're downloading, right? That's trackable now. Adrian, you mentioned last night the ReadCube example of what they're able to collect, what kind of data they're able to collect now because of the technology, and it's really problematic. I don't have an answer, but
Well, we want that, right? I mean,
Yeah, I'd just add, I mean, I think 50% of the publication output comes from 10 companies, and there's more and more market consolidation, but that shouldn't detract too, that the data is really important, but there are a number of sort of more independent publishers, the Canadian Science Publishings and JMIRs, that are trying to fill a role in society with groups and societies, and that's a different sort of place on the spectrum to be. But you're right, we have to sort of invest in the latest technologies too, and the latest infrastructures. So.
Hi. I had a question stemming from Sapna's point about the way we can kind of think of different ways of open access and fund initiatives. And I was really interested to hear, as we're talking about open access, are we talking about ethics? Because I'm coming from a background in anthropology, and there we do a lot of research with vulnerable groups where arguably open access research would not actually be ethical research. I'm just curious, are we having discussions about putting policies or infrastructures in place to make sure we can't just go out and do these research and maybe just put it out to the world in a way that's not very ethical to the communities we're working with?
I think it's a really important piece. And someone mentioned preprints earlier. And just an example is, there was such an advantage with preprints during COVID and being able to access information quickly and rapidly, and we needed it. At the same time, you got a lot of science junk, information came out, maybe communities weren't engaged in the right timing. And so, someone just brought up the point, like, it's evolving so fast. I think we need some strong leadership at a national level. We need ecosystem coherence, and it needs to be driven from an ethical place. And then we need to get everybody collectively behind that. And I'm not sure all of it is being driven by that piece, to be honest.
Just to add, though, I think it's also there are systems in place where data doesn't have to be fully open, but if the right research is there and requested, it can be, for the transparency to build on the research. So there are ways that authors and researchers can request access to that underlying data that did the research that I think should be available in the right time and place.
I think to follow is from the open science roadmap. The federal government is as open as possible, as close as necessary to protect vulnerable people. I just want to make sure there is a difference between open access publishing and open data and open science. So I actually think that while, yes, you want to protect certain data, maybe interview transcripts that would reveal who was interviewed, especially for vulnerable communities, the same probably goes for DNA studies, there might be reason to protect and not share the data. But I think still that it should be published open access, because you're not protecting anything by putting it behind a paywall. You're just allowing people that have the money to access it, but it's published. So I think there's often also a lot of misunderstanding of, open science is so much broader and even more complex than just open access to the literature.
Really quickly, I think it's also just being creative. So on the data side, there's a Global Alliance for Health. This is, I don't know if anyone's aware, but they have this beacon model where everybody has to aggregate their data from all these different places. And people who are pre-approved go into a software and can access it, but they can't see the individual. It's aggregated, so people can get access benefits from this data, but individually everyone, because a lot of it has IP and there's industry, there's a lot of other pieces. And so there's ethical ways and models out there, many different types, at least on the data side, that is working. But it takes more time, takes a lot of thought, and takes getting a lot of different stakeholders to go through a much more rigorous, complex process, but then the benefits are much wider. And so that takes some time and buy-in.
Okay. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts so far. I was struck by the mention of how journal brand names can be helping to maintain unhealthy publishing practices. And I think a lot of scientists would agree with that, but they would also probably retort that they themselves don't want to take the career risk of maybe publishing in I myself am trying to publish more in Diamond open access journals, but there is the perception that maybe on your CV it won't look as prestigious, and also I'm more of in an early career position, but I can empathize for a PI who had junior trainees who's like, I want to help this person get ahead in this hyper competitive field. And so, it maybe would be irresponsible of me to push them to, anyway, yeah, I think you get it. Thanks.
Yeah, I completely hear you. And that is why it's so tough for individual researchers to make a change. And that's why I think we need policy top down to change the rules and change the reward system and change it in people's heads that a paper in a high impact journal isn't automatically better than one in a maybe a newer, not as established journal, right? And also that peer review is not owned or done by the publisher, it's done by the community. But I completely hear you with that struggle. So I should say I'm mid-career now. I'm also still used to say early career, but I have tenure. And this year I was invited to join the journal of my field on the editorial board. And I have to say that pre-tenure, I might have thought about this a bit more, because that would have been a really shiny thing on the CV, right? To be on that editorial board. But this journal is a Wiley journal that is behind paywalls and only publishing hybrid. And I took actually a few days to answer, but I said, if you're willing to make the switch to open access, I'm happy to join and help you do it. But if not, I'm declining. And they said, no, they have no interest. So I said, no. But I think I would have probably, even though I know it's wrong to support this, thought about this more if I had been pre-tenure. It's hard.
To that as well, that I 100% agree with this perspective. And I think in the interim, one of the jobs that we as a library community have is to help facilitate some of that access for early career researchers in the place in which you are publishing. So I don't represent entirely the library community's perspective on this, because I take that from a very practical point of view. This is where you're publishing. What can we do to make your content available in open access? So we're doing some piece of that, and at the same time saying that's not the best model. We should be transitioning to something else. And while you're continuing to publish, and we're working on this larger scale perspective from the whole community that says promotion and tenure shouldn't be based on you being able to publish in Nature or wherever the heck.
Yeah, thank you. So access is one thing, but how quickly is the information become available to policymakers to make a quick decision, for example, during a public health emergency, for example? So I'm just asking. Thanks.
I don't have a ready answer. I will say this, in Scope 3, the high energy physics publishing initiative that we have going on, one of the things that we're looking at, we're negotiating the next, or we're approaching the next negotiations with publishers. And one of the things that we're looking at is adding potentially some other criteria to encourage, for example, a prompter speed of publication. On the other hand, the argument against that is then are you losing some of the peer review that is needed? And we have, I mean, certainly in that community, they have archives, so they can do pre-publication publishing. I don't know that there's an easy answer for this. I mean, because it's the balance between getting that, especially in the health sector, you know, getting validated, peer-reviewed information versus just putting information out there.
From a research funder perspective, this was a really good question, because my specialty, and I see Sandra here too, is knowledge mobilization, translation, implementation, adoption. If we're really trying to change policy, our research, a lot of the work that we do, we actually bring the stakeholders together and policymakers at the front end. And we need to bridge a better piece between the researchers. Publications is one thing, but I worked at Treasury Board for years. I was not reading journal articles. I'm just saying, right? I needed the funders to put some money and some weight and value on knowledge translation and partnerships and forms and other ways to get policymakers things they need quickly in a way they understand that aligns with the decision making that's useful. And I think that open access is critically important, but we also have to think who the audience who's reading that. And I'm not saying policymakers do not read that at all. I'm not saying that, but it's beyond just the open access. And I think as a researcher, we're realizing, like the DORA principles, that it's not just the value of the publishing, which is incredibly valuable and it needs to be peer reviewed. We need to put money in other mechanisms to allow that information to flow and to drive the adoption implementation piece. So I think just as a research funder, we are dramatically changing how we fund and approach this so we actually drive impact.
I'll just add to your question. I mean, it depends what sort of information and data you're wanting. But for example, one of our editors in mental health field, which is really just emerging, sits on a number of policy committees. You know, he reviews all the top papers and research that's been done and vets what's published and can really help contribute to the sort of broader discussion around policy on mental health. So bringing different people in from the communities that have that perhaps broader knowledge of the research and the publication and the different stages could be useful.
I was going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm Trushar Patel, University of Lethbridge in Alberta. So I really enjoyed the discussion, but I do have some concerns too brought forward. So we talked about open access, and we talked about Canadian science, and we talked about career of researchers as early career or late career. And we can do a lot of changes within Canada, but science and research is international. It's not only Canadian. So the STP committees, we can talk about promotions and tenure. Sure, I got promoted, I got tenured, but I still have to worry about my grant application. So the Tri-Council agencies value your impact factor and the publications and where you publish. When I apply for international awards or when I apply for other things, they value where you publish, okay? Publication also is very important for trainees, which we never talked about it. But even if I apply, let's say I publish in one of your journals, which is not my field, I'm a biochemist, but if I apply, submit a paper in a new journal, my trainee's name is the first author. My trainee needs to get a job, okay? So if I apply to that journal, and my trainee is competing with all the international trainees from UK and from India and from China and everywhere, they will not get shortlisted in a pool of applicants because they don't have one of those journals. I'll give you an example. We published a paper in Nature, and my trainee got a job offer right away to Harvard. So that is the level of impact that we are talking about. So we can make a lot of changes in theory that we want to make it, but the ground reality and practical is completely different. So I think we have to work with, if we call this mafia system or the cartel system, we have to work with them. There is no other way. We can spend a lot of years, we can spend a lot of money, we can spend a lot of discussions that will put Canadian science behind all the other countries. So that's what I want to put forward.
That's a really good point. And what you're describing, that's, I think, why 20 years later, we're still in this mess. That is the one reason. Because, yes, even if we have tenure, we're worried about our more junior people, we want to support them. But I want to say, if you're not ready to publish in diamond or gold open access journals, and move away from publishing in the prestigious sources, you can still go the green route. So you still publish in that prestigious journals, but you put a preprint, or ideally, if you are allowed to, and this is also very complex because of copyright, put the accepted manuscript on a repository. People can still access it, and we have studies that show that also improves the impact of the paywall paper itself because more people can read it. So small steps. Right? But I completely hear you, and I think that's why we're in this mess. It's the one reason why we are still so tied to keeping to pay the subscription, keeping to pay the hybrid APCs and so on. That's the exact reason. And I also don't know, except for the entire global community saying no more, I don't know how to solve it either, because you're always worried of being behind.
So we do put all the preprints and all of it where the repositories are. It still costs me every year $15,000 to $30,000 to publish my papers. My NSERC, renewed NSERC, is $40,000 a year. It doesn't cut the cost. CIHR doesn't get the money. So there is also a problem from the funder side where they want us to get the citations when they want us to put all the papers out in the open access journal. There is actually no funding support from any of those individual tri-council agencies either.
Add to this that in the end, the people that evaluate your proposals, right? That's us too. That's us researchers too, right? So I know that some funders have certain rules, and the same goes for tenure. I think there's this preconceived notion you have to publish in high impact, but in many tenure documents or collective agreements, as well as in the funding requirements, it doesn't say the impact factor has to be 20. It's more in our heads that we think this is the prestigious way to do it.
I do agree. For promotions, it's fine. When the money is tight by the funding agencies, the first thing what they want to do is cut out the applications and triage them, and that's where the impact factor becomes really important. You get comments that says, this person has published in lower to medium impact factor journal, or this person has published medium to high impact. So that is, these are the ground realities. We can argue about this all the time, but these are the realities.
I have a potential solution for this. So my name is Dom Roche. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at Carleton University and at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. My area of expertise is open data. I've been working on that for a number of years, but I've also been following the open access dossier for a while. And I've been scratching my head about this as well. I mean, as an early career researcher myself, I also find it very difficult to manage the pressures that are put upon us by the funding agencies and the hiring committees and whatnot to publish in prestigious journals versus doing the right thing. And so it's occurred to me that recently, like some funding agencies, so I'm thinking specifically about NSERC right now in Canada, has put a lot of importance on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, there's a lot, we're lacking diversity in academia, and it is really important for funders to improve in that area. And so right now, when you submit a proposal for a discovery grant, for example, at NSERC, there is a whole section on explaining what you are doing to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is great. So NSERC thought this was important. They moved the needle on that front, and things are happening. But nothing has happened in terms of open access, transparency, and reproducibility, which fundamentally is so important to science, right? But there's no section in NSERC applications right now where you can say, well, this is what I do actually to publish, make my research more openly accessible, more transparent, more reproducible. I realize that it can be really difficult to impose these requirements on researchers. You can't tell people stop publishing in Nature and Science. It'd be very difficult. Policy is important, but at least I think that these types of measures, so evaluating people on what they're doing on that front, could go a really long way in helping, move the needle. But I'd be curious to have your thoughts on whether you think that that is something that could be implemented and what effect it would have.
So that's what I think also, that the tri-agencies need to enforce the actually existing policy. But going further, that, it's more, it's open data, and all of these things that we do to do better science in its open framework does take more resources, right? If you publish your data, if you go the extra mile to be open access and so on, I feel like a lot of the policies now are put in place, but there's no resources to make them happen. So there is no extra support to now learn how to, publish a data set and so on, or the extra time to do it. I have a little hint for you. While this infrastructure doesn't exist to say open science is really important, you can spin the EDI part that open science is a way to achieve equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's what I've been doing.
Say on a funder side, it's funny, the tri-agencies as well as us, and I'm pretty sure NSERC, somewhere in there it says something about aligning with open access and all that. When you actually put a section in, because we've added a section on a few things recently, but not on the open access, people see the value. And it's not saying you have to do it, but people actually have to think about it, write about it, and it actually contributes to the scoring. Mm-hmm. So in that way, and then they can maybe put a budget item against it, or at least explain why there's some budget to it. I think what comes down to after that, that's where my mind goes, I'm so cynical, is people will write it, and then how do you follow up in compliance? So that's something that's just on my mind when you say that, but it is something I'm gonna bring back. We have a whole idea piece around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, but we do not talk about the open access piece. So it's a really good point.
Great, thank you. Just to add, I think, so the DEI component, my understanding, although I haven't applied for an NSERC discovery recently, is that it is scored. It's part of the evaluation process. And so I think that, yes, compliance is very difficult to do well, but nevertheless, in an application, people are able to show evidence that they are doing things, right? You can put links, that's right, hyperlinks, you can show how many of your data sets are open, how many of your papers are open access. And so if that's being scored in the evaluation process, I think that would be quite effective. But thank you for your comment.
I disagree, no. But just a note on this is again putting the weight of open access on the individual researcher. I mean, the Tri-Council does it, right? They say, yeah, you have to publish open access. We can give you money. So it's not the right strategy. But I have a question, because we're zoning in on the role of funders in shaping academic cultures around publication, here in this case, open access. And I'm wearing the hat of someone who actually created a fully open access journal using OGS, small journal, small society. And it's totally manageable to do it with no budget at all, because everybody puts in time and you hire your students on the side to do some of the editorial stuff, and it works. I also wear the hat of a president of an academic association who has a journal working with Cambridge, which is one of the better ones, but still, there's a way in which it would be possible for academic organizations to run their journals using OGS. And I'm wondering if there's a role for funders, academic funders, in not only giving money, because SSHRC does have a program to support scholarly publications, right? So you can throw money at it and people, but the problem is really in the capacity of people to take it on and to, so what would be, how should academic associations gang up to create the sort of infrastructure that would allow them to publish their journals open access? What would the funding model work? I mean, what kind of contributions could the funders do? Not only in terms of money, but in terms of training, support. So I'm just throwing that out there.
I think there are 2 points on the OJS. One thought, we use OJS, we work with the community, but I think there needs to be, we publish 5,000 articles a year, peer-reviewed, and there needs to be ways it can be adapted and evolved at scale and using the latest technologies that programmers and people use. So if the community could come together and work with the OJS team, I know they do have plugins and give code back, but I know there's people at OJS sort of looking at that and working on that. And I think your second point, there is an initiative called Subscribe to Open for the Diamond Journals, where in essence, it does feel like institutions will put money in to make things open access. In some ways, you could argue it's a little like a subscription model that you get so many of these subscriptions and OAs, and then everything's open access. But there are communities and groups like that that come together and work and talk about that. But you still need somebody to go out to 50 institutions to get a Subscribe to Open fee to make everything add up and work or something like that.
Hi. I think this panel has been really fabulous, and just looking at the makeup of this group, we see all the multiple players that are involved in making some sort of change in the system. And the discussions today have touched on science policy and the funder role and the influence of a top-down approach. But I really wanted to zone in on some of the temporary solutions to help support the community. So this really is a question more for Claire. I worked for a funder, so I understand the influence that they can have. I've now moved into a librarian role, and I'm really curious about the supports that a librarian can offer the community. So in the very, very short time I've been in this role, I've seen a lot of requests, for example, from researchers for support in paying APCs from an APC fund within an institution. But from the discussions, we now understand that that's not the best use of money. So Claire, you've spoken about these transformative agreements, and I really want to understand what we can do to make sure that it is a transition and it is temporary. So we've learned, for example, that the hybrid model, which was supposed to be a temporary solution to kind of shift the system towards open, has now been really a well-established practice by publishers where they're extracting money from the system. So how can we make sure that the transition with transformative agreements is temporary and publishers don't find really a more permanent solution to continue to extract money from the system?
It's the tough questions, no problem. Thank you. Great question. We had our conference, a CRKN conference 2 weeks ago now, and we spent a whole day in a workshop talking about this. And I can tell you, we don't have an answer in that, a quick answer. I think that it's difficult for an individual library to have, as you said, yes, researchers come to you and say, please give me some money for my APC. I think our job as a community is to work together, which we do through CRKN, through Carl, through our regional library consortia as well, to work with the publishers and change that. And it's flippin' hard work. I can tell you that when we are sitting in front, and I'm very grateful. We had a stakeholder alignment group that worked with us on our last Elsevier negotiation, and that's coming up again soon. but we had to bring in presidents of universities, the U15, Universities Canada, Mona Niemer. I mean, we had to bring in Rémi Quirion as well to sit down in front of those publishers and say, this is not a library problem. This is an academy problem, and the whole community is behind the library when we say no to non-disclosure agreements, no to continuing to charge us outrageous amounts of money for subscription agreements, if it's a subscription agreement we're in, no to charge incredibly high prices for APCs to our research directly. And then as a community, we have to negotiate to say, we are going to set the amount of money that we in Canada are willing to pay, because that's what the publisher is coming to us, right? They want Elsevier, for example, gets $34 million out of Canadian universities in subscriptions annually, US dollars, and that's how much money they want. That's not counting their APC revenue, which we know is huge. Yeah. So it's our job then to turn around and say, as a community, collectively, not just the library community, but collectively, no, we're only willing to pay this amount to publish in your journals. And we want to be able to read those journals for free. So I think that the job that I feel I need to do as part of this, to be part of that solution, is to continue to work with our whole community, not just with the libraries individually, and to work globally. And I really appreciate that one of the previous questions. It's not a Canadian-only problem, right? Unless we're working globally with our colleagues around the world, we will not solve this problem as well. And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at CSB, who, thank you, Mike, for organizing this panel, because we want to do open access here in Canada. And Canadian Science Publishing has a wonderful number of researchers publishing in Canadian Science Publishing journals. We cannot harness enough subscription revenue within Canada to totally turn that on its head and be able to pay to publish instead of pay to read. And I'm not talking about APCs, I'm just talking about straight how much revenue can be brought in. We can't do it. We need that to be a global solution. So we're doing what we can together in partnership with CSP, but this is a bigger problem, and we have to work collaboratively, not just within the library community, but with publishers together, with funding agencies, with government and policymakers.
Just to add that to Claire, I mean, if you look at what the University of California system did, they did say no with all the faculty and support to Elsevier. They've finally gone back and renegotiated a deal, a better deal, but it took all that community and the libraries and the central body to support each other and say, we're going to live without this access. I'll make a couple of other quick points on that. In the UK, the UKRI Research Institution and JISC, they give out block grants that enables the libraries to have that OA fund, and they manage that sort of process. On the flip side, there's also unintended consequences. If you look at Germany and something called Project Deal, a national German-wide deal, Wiley and the big publishers did those deals. What happened then is that actually changed author behavior. So more authors were submitting articles to Wiley journals because it was free, and they were going away from the sort of independent publishers. So while you encourage the sort of transition to OA, and it's great, there can be unintended consequences that people are not aware of. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I'm so sorry, we had one final question, but we are out of time today, so I don't think we can answer it, but we'll stay. So yeah, if you'd like to chat with us during the session. Thank you to all the wonderful questions that came from the floor. That really made this a really special session. And thank you to our great panelists here. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.